You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am excited. My guest is Peter Elliott, the author of a new book that's exploring a little bit of the looting of art in World War II. I mean, the book is literally called Looted, but I'm so excited because I always am fascinated by the World War II era and the movement of art and the change in the art scene. So thank you very much for coming to join me, Peter Elliott.
Well, I'm delighted to be joining you, Kyle.
So right off the bat, listeners, if you want to pick up a copy, the book is called Looted, the Nazi Art Plunder of Jewish Families in France. Obviously, a bit of a heavy topic, but it is a fascinating time period. And I'm curious, just to get us started, can you tell us, what inspired you to want to focus on these families in France and the taking of the art? I mean, it's a gloomy topic to be steeped in. What made you want to do this research and write this book?
Well, Kyle, it may be a gloomy topic, but in fact, it's just a fascinating period of French history because what are called the dark years in France. They're years which are so ambiguous. You've got collaboration on the one hand, you've got resistance on the other hand. So I've always been fascinated by that period of French history. The story of Nazi looted art is a small part of that story, but it actually shows all the interesting aspects of the broader story. I became interested in the topic of Nazi looted art in France. As long ago as 2012, but I took a long time to figure out how I would approach the topic. It's been covered from a lot of angles. It's been covered from the point of view of the stories of particular paintings. It's been covered particularly well by members of families who actually lost looted art, i.e. their own particular family stories. And of course, some of the art looters, the Nazi art looters, they've been covered in separate books. But I finally read an article about 3 years ago, which said, really, historians and researchers should concentrate on what this author called the missing perspective. Concentrate on the art collectors, because they were the ones who contributed so much to art and culture in France. So that's what drew me to the idea of telling the stories of some families. I then started looking at connections between particular art collectors. There was a particular series of restitutions in 2017, and I found that there was a connection between some of these art collectors. There were business relationships and there were friendships. Mm-hmm. Now, the common link was that all these people originated in Alsace, Lorraine. I'm sure you know that's the part of the territory that's always been somewhat disputed between Germany and France. And these families had to leave Alsace-Lorraine when that territory became German in 1870, because particularly the young folk there, they were faced with, if they opted to stay in Alsace, they were liable for Prussian military service. If they wanted to opt for France, they had to leave everything behind. So these were people who chose France, left everything behind, started their lives again. And that seemed to me an incredible story. And, these were people who did fantastic things in France. Now, my main story is about the Galerie Lafayette family. Now, Galerie Lafayette is the biggest department store in Paris, and there are branches of Galerie Lafayette through France. The founder was a fellow called Théophile Bada. Now, he had two sons-in-law who came from the same Alsatian background, Max Heilbronn and Raoul Meyer. This family also established the stores that are called Monoprix, that are lower priced stores. And I suppose at the core of the book and at the core of the story of the Galerie Lafayette family is their story during the German occupation of France. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on their story, even though there are 4 families, because otherwise it's a bit confusing to dart from one family to another. But, just to remember, there are 4 histories, and I don't want to downplay the importance of the other 3 families. Just touching on the second family, the Wertheimer family, I'll call them the Parfum Chanel family. They created the perfume house Chanel. They had a tempestuous relationship with Coco Chanel, who ended up as a Nazi collaborator. So it's an interesting story in itself. Now, these first 2 families, the Galerie Lafayette family and the Wertheimer family, they had quite close links. The original Wertheimer was the one who provided the loan to Bader to actually do his incredible development of the Art Deco building in 1909. And later, Bader became a minority shareholder in Wertheimer's Parfum Chanel business. So, it just shows these were people who trusted each other and liked to do business together, and they were friends.
Yeah, and I love that you're writing a book that's giving that different perspective and centering on the humanity of the people who were the victims here that were enduring and trying to survive an unthinkable situation, and the hardships that they were enduring. Because very often, and I myself am guilty of this, we get distracted by sort of the shiny object, the beautiful images, the stories that are just so bananas. I think of like the Han van Meegeren forgeries being floated around and stuff like that, and these things that are fascinating histories, but often it's centered around the perpetrators and the art that's shifted around. And I love that you're bringing all that human perspective into, the implications for the real people whose lives were upended and whose collections were taken. Because I think that is an important thing to be mindful of. But before we get into too much of the weeds on this, I think it's important to sort of set the scene for listeners who may not be as familiar. Can you start us off with just sort of like broad strokes of what was happening with, I feel like World War II was especially a big deal with the connections to the art world. I mean, Hitler, obviously the famous failed artist, but then there was a lot of Nazi looting of art. And I know all wars have, looting and things that happened, but can you explain a bit, like, why was this such a notable case and why were the Nazis so interested in taking these pieces?
Well, I think there are certainly 2 aspects to that. What I'd like to do is just take you back to the build-up to the war. We start obviously in 1933, which was when the Nazis came to power. 1933 to 1939, we start to see strands of this emerging because it was a firm part of Nazi ideology that they simply preferred pure classical art and they detested a modernist art. So they banned modernist artists, they confiscated their artworks. And these weren't simply Jewish artists. I mean, there were some Jewish artists like Kandinsky and Chagall, but equally an artist such as Emil Nolde, and there's been quite a concentration on him recently. He was a Nazi sympathizer. He was an anti-Semite, but his style was modernist. So they targeted him in the same way. And I'm sure you're aware of the great Degenerate art exhibition that took place. Well, in fact, works by all those artists, Kandinsky, Chagall, Emil Nolde, were shown at that art exhibition in Munich in 1937, where the whole purpose of the Nazis was to ridicule their art. So there's that strand before the war even began. And then, of course, there's just returning to France. What was happening in France? Well, you had actually a buildup of anti-immigrant sentiment in France because there were refugees fleeing fascism coming into France, and there was anti-immigrant sentiment, but also anti-Semitism. The arguments were familiar. These were people who were taking French jobs, etc. We're so familiar with those arguments today. But that actually extended to attacks on Jewish establishment figures like Theophile Bardot, who I've mentioned, the founder of Galerie Lafayette. So this was part of quite a broad pattern, and it explains why it was that Vichy France, the Vichy government in France, emerged so strongly anti-Semite in 1940. So that was the background. As regards the looting of Jewish-owned artworks, well, of course, that was simply a part of a much broader pattern of persecution. As soon as the Germans occupied France, you had parallel German and Vichy laws. Jewish property and businesses were able to be seized. Jewish persons were barred from a range of employment. The Galerie Lafayette family were dismissed from their management positions within their own store, and they had to flee as a result. Very quickly, the Germans located and seized their artworks, even though they were well hidden in a bank vault some way away from Paris. Now, this was the seizing of art, the seizing of belongings, the seizing of property. It was all an integral part of the Nazi dehumanization of the Jewish people. That's how it emerged, and that was the pattern of the process. As regards art looting itself, perhaps I can give you a few examples from the Galerie Lafayette experience.
Well, yeah, but just before we get too much into that, I do want to ask like one question that kind of weighs in my mind, and I wonder to what extent this was the propaganda effort and the dehumanization you talked about. The Degenerate Art Show is obviously a famous example of that, and trying to bolster their vision of what, it meant to be a good, authentic German or whatever, by putting down others. And how many things were looted as just like pure opportunism, like people seeing like, hey, these works, I can go in and take this and I can, make a bunch of money and have a masterpiece. Because if I recall correctly, I've seen that some of the looted they're keeping some stuff for private collections as well. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I think what you have to remember is at the outset, late 1940, when actually the seizures of the big collections started, the Nazis actually put out the story that their aim was to safeguard the artworks of the Jewish people who had fled Paris and had left their big apartments and houses empty. So they said they were safeguarding the artworks. Of course, they weren't doing that at all. They were looting the artworks, but they held to that message really throughout the process.
Now, sorry, I had sidetracked us with that question, but you were going to get into a story that. Can you talk to us about? I can never pronounce a French thing. The Lafayette you were starting to build up to there.
Well, the reason why I want to continue to talk about the Galerie Lafayette family is that the looting of their art was really absolutely copybook German art looting. They only had a relatively small collection, 26 paintings, the two sides of the family, but they were by very prominent Impressionist painters. And these paintings were seized. They were taken to Paris. They came under the control of a very sinister organization called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. Now, Rosenberg was the Nazi ideologue who headed that organization. It was a task force whose job was to oversee this whole process. And they had control of a sorting house at a small museum in the center of Paris called the Jeu de Paume. And there they took in these artworks and they went methodically through a process of recording them, etc. They all had inventory numbers. For example, the Heilbronn paintings that were numbered Heilbronn 1 to 10, Mayer numbered 1 to 13. There were inventories when the paintings were seized. So each painting was listed, dimensions, title, painter. They were photographed in the Louvre and then taken across to the Jeu de Paume, where art historians catalogued them. For each painting, there was a card in a card index, which again recorded all the data on the painting. So this was bureaucratic looting.
Yeah.
I think you had a previous podcast, Carl, where you talked about the book Art Spy, Rose Vallon.
Oh, yeah. We did an interview there. Yeah.
I mean, she's a small player in my story, but she is at the center of the activity in the Jeu de Paume because it was she who kept those secret records about the origins of the artworks, which collectors they'd been taken from, and also where they were sent to in Germany and the East. That is their destination. So that information was absolutely essential to tracing artworks after the war. So that was important. And of course, we talked about the modernist paintings and Nazi hatred of them. Well, they were dealt with in a very particular fashion in the Jeu de Paume. There was a special room, inaccessible room called the Salle des Martyrs, the Room of the Martyrs. But people like Marshal Göring could have access to that room. And in fact, even though he was a Nazi, he was very interested in modernist art. And he visited the Jeu de Paume about 20 times. Now, these paintings that were held separately like that, they were not dispatched to depots in Germany or the East. They were actually used as almost a form of currency. They were exchanged for pure classical artworks. For example, you'd get 3 wonderful modernist paintings exchanged for 1 classical painting. Now, this involved a series of notorious looted art dealers. Now, these dealers would do the exchanges, and then they would actually sell the paintings into markets outside France, particularly a country such as Switzerland, not too far geographically. And there were buyers there who were prepared to buy paintings without asking too many questions.
Yeah, and this is what kind of, just to make a connection that I realize I didn't explicitly state before, but I had alluded to like Han van Meegeren earlier, and this is what provided the opportunities for these types of unscrupulous people to pass off forgeries and sell them to Nazis, and then he was caught and seen as a collaborator and all sorts of problems along those lines. I did an episode on that. I'll put links in the show notes for people who want to learn more. But it's a fascinating thing. But you started to allude to the records that were kept, and again, I'll put a link in the show notes. I did an interview on the Art Spy, but that was pivotal in the efforts to, trace things and unwind some of the damage and restitution efforts. And so after a short break, I want to get into a little bit of the history of what happened later and efforts to bring pieces back to the rightful owners. Welcome back. My guest this week is Peter Elliott, the author of the new book, Looted, the Nazi Art Plunder of Jewish Families in France. And, you talked a bit before about how these pieces were taken. And, we mentioned that, there were some records being kept as pieces were being moved around. So there is some evidence of where some pieces came from. Can you talk a little bit about, the what do we call it? Restoration effort? Not really
Restitution.
Restitution efforts. Thank you. It's early morning here, but can you talk a little bit about those restitution efforts and what was happening after the war and trying to recover and bring things back?
Well, actually, the story on restitution and recovery begins before the end of the war, because in the last days of the occupation, the Germans were hastily putting as many of the artworks that remained in Paris into the carriages of a train in order to make the last train shipment out of Paris. Well, again, Rose Vallon, who was the subject of your podcast on Art Spy, she passed information on that train to the resistance. And the resistance had absolutely remarkable skills in being able to delay a train, because there were people who worked for the railways in the resistance, and they knew all sorts of techniques to detain a train. And so they delayed its departure. And by the time the Germans had left Paris, this train was still sitting in a railway siding in a place called Aulnay-sous-Bois. There was a film about it with Burt Lancaster. Now, actually, that led to the recovery of 7 Heilbronn Mayer paintings, which, when you think about it, that was almost a third of the total of their combined collection. So it was a huge, quick win. Now, on the other hand, there were some paintings which we probably have to conclude were permanently lost. 4 paintings owned by the Mayer and Heilbronn families were sent to a place called the Nikolsburg Castle. Now, that was in the Czech Republic. Now, we know that castle was burnt to the ground in April 1945. I've got some excellent photographs of it, and you can see there was virtually nothing left of it. Now, assuming those paintings were still in the castle, we have to conclude they're probably lost forever, and certainly they haven't turned up. Now, again, going back to the modernist painting story, some of the paintings were exchanged. They went through notorious art dealers such as Fabiani and Rochlitz. They may well have ended up in private collections outside France, some in Switzerland. It's strange how Switzerland crops up so often in looted art provenance.
Can I ask, if it's in a private collection today, I mean, I feel like I know, obviously, the moral and ethical thing is to return things to the rightful owners and the heirs and stuff like that. But what are the legal obligations? Is there like a statute of limitations on that kind of thing?
Well, let me give you the Swiss example, because it's quite an interesting one. The Swiss actually were very protective of possessors of artworks after the war. They actually had a 5-year statute of limitations. And if you hadn't claimed your looted artwork within 5 years, you then had to prove that the painting had been acquired in bad faith by the possessor of the painting. Now, any lawyer knows that to prove that somebody did something in bad faith is unbelievably hard. And actually, it's part of one of the paintings that I'll tell you about later on, that, Raoul Mayer, for example, tried to recover a painting of a shepherdess by Pissarro in the early 1950s. And he launched a lawsuit in Switzerland, but he just couldn't discharge that burden of proving that the possessor had acquired it in bad faith, so it disappeared.
Oh, it's just awful upon awful. Sorry, I derailed you again with my thoughts and
that's all right. That's fine.
I'm just so curious, and I so seldom get to talk to somebody who knows so much and is so steeped in all of this stuff. So thank you.
Actually, that little diversion was useful, because it does illustrate a little bit of background in relation to a painting, the shepherdess, the Pissarro, that I'll tell you about later on. That there was a guy who tried to recover it actually not all that long after the war, but failed because of very restrictive laws. But you asked about the process for tracing and returning artworks after the war. Well, they actually set up a rather formal process. The Allies managed to identify in which depots in Germany some of these artworks were held. Now, for example, they were held in castles like the great Ludwig Castle, Neuschwanstein. I don't know whether you know it at all, but that was filled with artworks. There was a salt mine in which paintings were held because actually they could be held under good conditions, underground. And they identified the depots. They then took the paintings to 4 collecting points, which were established by the Allies in Germany. The most important collecting point was actually in Munich. The individual owners, of course, all made claims for their looted art, but they made their claims to their own governments, and it was then for their government to try and progress their claim with the collecting point, say in Munich or elsewhere in Germany. There was one quite helpful step in trying to advertise which paintings had been looted. In France, they published a catalogue which was called the Répertoire, Le Répertoire des Arts Spoliés. And this listed all the paintings against the owner, the artist, the title of the work, the dimensions. But unfortunately, this was a day in which publications weren't exactly liberal with images and illustrations. So very few of the paintings are actually illustrated. And it's very difficult to identify an artwork without an illustration. But it was a help. And actually that process did lead to the return of 4 of the Mayer Hellbronn paintings. And in total, out of that process, 45,000 artworks were returned to owners. But there were also 2,000 artworks where they failed to match paintings with owners, even though they held them and they knew they were looted. But those paintings were entrusted to museums in France. The museums didn't get title to the paintings. They were just entrusted to them to look after them. Those are the so-called MNR artworks, Musées Nationaux Récupération. And to this day, if you walk around a French museum, you'll see a little label next to a painting, MNR number whatever, and then you'll know it's one of those paintings.
Oh, that is fascinating. See, I think there are a lot of people who wouldn't have realized that that's the significance of that little label. And I also just want to repeat that number you dropped of 45,000 pieces. You know, like you always know that a fair amount of art was looted and all of that, but like tens of thousands of pieces, like that is just a mind-boggling amount. And you said that's the number that was returned. So then the number that was taken was even significantly more than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's very difficult to know, but the headline number I always have in the back of my mind was about 100,000.
Yeah.
And who
I
knows?
think that's just such a massive scale that a lot of people don't like. We know that pieces were taken, but like so many things were taken. That is just it's hard for me to wrap my head around. But I think it's worth knowing because like those concrete numbers, I think to understand the scale is to understand the problem. And I think it's cool that MNR signifies that was a piece that was entrusted to the museum for, you know, stewardship or whatever, for safekeeping, you know.
Well, exactly. But I think it's now pretty well recognized universally that those museums did very little for 60 years to try and find owners. It was only later when the whole process became reinvigorated that, more traction has been gained in returning some of those pieces to owners. But because I'm steeped in this subject, when I go to a French museum, I always look at the labels to see if there's an MNR work because it just fascinates me.
Yeah, and you said decades later it was, the effort was reinvigorated. What was the catalyst for that?
Well, I suppose the catalyst was very simple. Jacques Chirac in 1995, he finally acknowledged the responsibility of France in the deportation of the Jews. It was a massive step for France to recognize that. And it was then that the interest revived. And some of the latest, what I'll tell you in relation to a specific painting, which was recovered, much more recently, it all started with the revival of the process after that acknowledgement of responsibility, because it sort of cleared the air and the whole process started again.
And I think that teases things nicely. We've already dropped the name Pissarro and everything. So I think one last short break, and let's get into that story of the Pissarro piece. Welcome back again. My guest today, Peter Elliott, the author of Looted, the Nazi art plunder of Jewish families in France. You can pick up a copy at Amazon or wherever you get your books. But today, I think it's good to understand the story of a specific work because, you dropped the number like somewhere around 100,000 pieces have been taken. And that's just like, that's such a vast amount. It becomes an abstraction for me. And I think it's nice to understand the scale of the problem, but I also really like to understand the specifics. So can we focus on that one piece you talked about? You mentioned the Pissarro view of the Seine. Can you tell us that story?
Let's do it. I just want to mention for the benefit of your readers that one of the things I do in the book is try to be specific about interesting stories on a number of paintings, because the individual journeys of the paintings in this whole period are fascinating. Now, this is a case in point. Max Heilbronn, one of the sons-in-law of Bada of the Galerie Lafayette, he owned a beautiful painting by Camille Pissarro, who's really known as the painter of light and color. It's a painting of the Louvre, the morning. It's made from the Pont Neuf, which is one of the great bridges of Paris. It's a scene of the banks of the Seine River, with the Louvre in the background. Now, Pissarro actually painted about 60 works of the same view over a period of 3 years. You might ask yourself why. Well, he owned a flat, he rented a flat. And from the window of that flat, he could capture this view or several variants of the view. And many artists love to do repeated paintings of a similar view, but just in different light, different seasons, etc. Now, there were probably about 9 of these paintings of exactly the same view as that Heilbronn owned. So you can imagine the potential confusion when it comes to a process where you're trying to identify whether the artwork is the one you lost or whether it was somebody else's. And that potential for confusion is at the heart of the story I'm going to tell you. This was one of the modernist art paintings, which was part of that exchange process, which I told you about. The ERR exchanged this painting with the art dealer Rochlitz. He took the painting to one of his stores. This particular store was in Bavaria. And after that, we just lose sight of what happened to the painting until 1950, when at the collecting point in Munich, I told you there were 4 collecting points. Munich was the principal one. They became aware that a painting of this view of the Seine by Pissarro was being offered for sale in the city. And they communicated that to Max Heilbronn because of his claim to a painting of that scene. Now, it was a requirement of the claim process at that stage that he needed to provide both a photograph and the dimensions of the painting. 2 problems. The Heilbronn family had commissioned a Paris art expert to do an inventory of their artworks shortly before the capitulation of the French in 1940. A very sensible measure because they knew things were getting pretty scary. Unfortunately, the expert recorded the wrong measurement for this particular painting. Also, Heilbronn himself had no photograph of the painting. So he was faced with a challenge. He provided measurements which were wrong and no photo. The problem was the only photo that there was a photo taken by the Germans themselves in Paris. The ERR organization had their own photographers, took brilliant black and white photographs. But that photograph was part of the court record in Nuremberg, because the Nuremberg trials were going on at the same time, and art looting was part of those trials. So the people at the collecting point didn't have access to that photo, and they overlooked the fact that there was a German inventory drawn up in 1940 at the time that the Heilbronn and Mayer paintings were seized, which did record the right measurement, but they overlooked that. So there we have Heilbronn claiming a painting but giving the wrong measurement and not being able to give a photograph. And then we have the confusion that at the same time, Pierre Wertheimer had a painting of the same view. I told you there were about 9 of them. Well, he was claiming, he was making a competing claim because he heard that there was this painting of the view of the Seine, the banks of the river. So faced with a competing claim and a claim from Heilbronn, which was deficient, no photo, wrong measurements, Heilbronn's claim was rejected. So this painting disappeared for another 60 years. And then after that, we had that period which I told you about when nothing happened at all because people were just wanting to forget the war. 1960 to 1990. It's called the 30 years of silence. And then we had Jacques Chirac's speech where he acknowledged the responsibility for the deportations, and interest revived. So that was the trigger that started the process again. We then had an absolutely curious event in Germany. A Pissarro painting. The Pissarro painting resurfaced as part of what's known as the Gurlitt Trove. You've probably heard of the Gurlitt Trove because it was a massive trove of some 1,700 artworks, which were found in 2 properties of a fellow called Cornelius Gurlitt. Now, Cornelius was the son of a well-known wartime dealer in degenerate art called Hildebrand Gurlitt. And in 2010, customs officers arrested Gurlitt on a train. He was acting suspiciously. They found a large quantity of cash on him. So they searched his 2 properties and they found this huge trove of artworks. Now, quite shortly after the discovery, Gurlitt himself died. And he complicated the issue by actually leaving his artworks to the Kunstmuseum of Bern. So now there was a new museum party involved in this. But that museum actually worked very diligently with the authorities to try to identify the looted paintings among this trove. And there was a detailed provenance investigation of the Pissarro painting, and it was actually found to be the painting which Heilbronn had owned of the Pont Neuf. And it was finally restituted to Heilbronn's daughter, Jeanette Heilbronn, who was known under her married name, Jeanette Moulin, and it was returned to her in 2017. Madame Moulin regrettably died early this year, but at a very fine age. So that painting was finally restituted to that family after all that time. But the odd thing is, and it's worth remarking, that art dealers in southern Germany were quite aware of this Gurlitt art collection. for years and years, but a painting like this just lay undisturbed. So there was a degree of complicity of the art world in this. Can I touch on a few other missing paintings that were recovered a long time after the war?
Absolutely. I mean, like I say, I think, the thing I like about your book is you're focusing and centering on these very human stories of the families whose work was taken. And I love hearing this perspective that I seldom get, and I think it's important. So by all means, I would love to hear more.
I'm glad you put it that way, because then I'll open with telling you very briefly, touching on the next story, a wonderful painting by Renoir, A Vase of Roses. Renoir did lots of paintings of roses. He liked flower pieces a lot. Now, this painting was actually auctioned by one of the great auction houses in 1999. And Madame Moulin, the daughter of Max Heilbronn, heard that it was actually being shown in the window of an art dealer in Paris. And she clearly got in touch with the person who'd bought it at the auction. I know nothing about the negotiation or the discussion. All I do know is that when the New York Times did an interview with Madame Moulin in, I think, 2012, they published a brilliant color photograph of Madame Moulin sitting on the settee of her living room with a wall of paintings behind her, but clearly identifiable on that wall is Renoir's Roses. And what I liked was that she said, "Oh, I had to actually buy this painting back at half price." Now, actually, that sounds a crazy thing to have to do. But when you look at the difficulty people have had with litigation in recovering artworks, it was probably a very astute move. And she said that she hung it on her wall as an act of revenge. I loved the spirit of the lady.
Yeah. I mean, from a practical standpoint, it is probably cheaper to pay half price on the painting than pay all the lawyers and the legal fees associated with it. And, to prove that what seems like, such strong evidence, if I recall correctly, like Wolfgang Beltracchi would have his wife dress up in period attire and take a photograph with an old camera on old photo paper to create similar forged provenance for works that he was passing off. So, I'm not accusing anything similar happening here. I'm just saying, like, it probably is, even with something so strong, it's still probably a bit of a climb to prove it. But I love that she eventually got it.
I think part of the problem, Carl, is that the legal process is just about the worst sort of system to try and deliver what I call justice in this sort of area, because it's a winner-take-all process, isn't it? And the only people who really win are the litigation lawyers. And I can say that with feeling, because I am an ex-lawyer. Fortunately, I wasn't a litigation lawyer. But I would love to see a simpler process developed to take account of the fact that there are often situations in which, say, a 1950s buyer of a painting bought a painting in good faith and owned it for, 70 years or so, but the painting was clearly looted. Well, wouldn't it be great if there was a slightly simpler process of, say, having some sort of enforced agreement that the painting should be lodged with a museum, forevermore shown in a museum, and the history of looting should be memorialized? I mean, as a historian, that's what I would like to see happen. Unfortunately, that's sort of wishful thinking.
Yeah, open a museum of looted art. Although I guess on some level that's most museums.
Yeah, but can I just touch just on one other painting, because
absolutely,
I touched on it. When we were talking about the strange journeys of paintings, I talked about Raoul Meyer having tried to recover a painting in a lawsuit, a Pissarro, in the 1950s, but failing because of the very strict Swiss laws. Well, that painting, actually, the same painting that he tried to recover in Switzerland in the 1950s, failed because he lost the lawsuit. He couldn't prove that the buyer was in bad faith. It resurfaced in 2012, and Madame Meyer, who's the adopted daughter of Raoul Meyer, and interesting, it's as well to point out that she was a Holocaust victim herself. Her entire family was lost in the Holocaust, and as a result, she was adopted by Raoul Meyer. So she always said that her determination to try and recover looted artworks was both the memory to her biological parents, but also in memory of her adoptive parents, which I thought was a nice way of looking at it. She tried to recover this painting. It had been held in a private collection in Oklahoma since the 1950s. It had eventually been given to the Oklahoma University Museum. There was some negotiation as to whether they were prepared to return the painting, but it came to nothing. There were two bouts of very expensive litigation between 2014 and 2021, and two very unsatisfactory settlement agreements. The lawyers made a lot of money. Title eventually returned to the University Museum in Oklahoma, but part of the settlement was a very complicated arrangement to continue to rotate this painting between the two countries with which it was associated, France and the United States. So you can imagine there's a requirement to rotate this painting every 3 years. So a painting has to cross the Atlantic every 3 years. And there's also a requirement that a long-term institutional owner has to be identified for the painter. For the painting. Well, as a matter of fact, the program seems to be delayed. A long-term owner hasn't been found, and it hasn't yet gone back to France for its first rotation. So who knows how that process will finally be sorted out.
And I'm like stressed just thinking about those logistics. I mean, transporting pieces back and forth every 3 years, like, because I did an interview a while back talking to a curator in a museum, and just like hearing about all the stuff, the logistics, the the conditions, the boxing, the air quality tests and stuff that they are doing when they're transporting these works of art. It is I'm glad I don't have those headaches to deal with and figure out how to make all that happen. And I can see why it's difficult for them to execute that agreement.
I would say that the settlement was a lawyer's dream, but not a satisfactory long-term outcome for
anybody.
A painting which is interesting, but certainly it's a very burdensome arrangement. Carl, can I just finally tell your listeners about the other two families whose stories I covered? But I will be very brief. But I just don't want to leave them out completely, just so that they know about the breadth of this story of four families.
Oh, absolutely. Give us a little tease for what they can find out in the book.
Well, that's what I'll do, because actually, what I explained to you at the outset was neither the Galeries Lafayette family nor the Parfum Chanel family were really art collectors at the outset. They had large houses, they had walls to fill, so art was bought almost as a house decoration. But they became lovers of art and art collectors. But the last two protagonists, if I may call them, were absolutely fervent art collectors. The first was a couple called Pierre and Denise Levy. Now, they both were great business people. They created one of the biggest textile businesses in France in a city called Troyes, Troyes, which is just on the fringe of the Champagne area, but about 1.5 hours from Paris. They were passionate about art. They were lifelong friends of the artists, particularly artists like Maurice Marino, André Derain. They also bought direct from Matisse and Dufy, and they assembled an absolutely unrivaled modernist art collection. And it spans 100 years, 1850 to 1950. And they gave their entire art collection to the nation. And it now forms the core of the collection, which is shown at the Modern Art Museum of Troyes. So if any of your listeners are visiting Paris, I do urge them to get on a train and go up to Troyes and visit the Musée Moderne d'Art de Troyes and see this wonderful modern collection. Now, I think it's just such a privilege to be able to go to a place and still see, kept together, a collection assembled by a couple over so many years. Yeah. And if I can also mention the final protagonist, Georges Levy, because he was a mercurial man. I became absolutely fascinated by him. He was a financial genius. He actually constructed seaplanes during World War I, and they were instrumental in carrying on the battle against the German U-boats in that war. So he made one fortune in that way, but doing something noble. He then made a fortune as a banker, possibly less noble, but by the age of 40, he was able to retire with his fortune. He was able to escape the worst outcomes of the financial crisis in France in the early 1930s, and he simply devoted his time to collecting art. He bought a chateau near Chartres, really to accommodate his art.
As one does.
Yeah, you know. As one does. But the interesting thing was that I should mention that the two Levies, the Levies of Troyes, managed to hide their art during the war because they had a friend who was a Louvre art curator who was looking after Louvre artworks in a remote chateau in the south of France. And that friend just put the 100 or so paintings owned by Pierre and Denise Levy amongst those Louvre artworks. And indeed, there was a wonderful Derain painting just hanging on the kitchen wall above the stove. That must have caused a stir at the time. But Georges Levy did something else, and that is he managed to smuggle his 38 most outstanding paintings out of occupied France via Lisbon to America. And we believe that he managed to get them on a refugee ship going from Lisbon to America. So to a large extent, Georges Levy's art collection was saved, but he did lose some paintings to looting. And those individual stories are also fascinating, and I deal with them in the book. So of the four families, what I would say is that they shared the experience of flight and refuge from occupied France, but their individual stories are very different. And I think your readers will get something different from each of those four stories.
Absolutely fascinating. And, you know, it's a time period, like I have always been a lover of modern art, and, you know, that time period has always fascinated me because there's so much upheaval, so much change happening that shaped the course of, you know, the world for decades to come. And I love that your book gives us not only so much detail and historical information, which you've obviously shared, but the human connection and these stories that are so often missed. listeners, if you want to pick up a copy, again, links in the show notes. Looted, the Nazi art plunder of Jewish families in France is available in stores now. And, I cannot thank you enough, Peter Elliott, for taking the time, sharing your insights and your expertise. I always love getting to learn from people who have clearly done so much research and so much about this topic that is absolutely fascinating and important for us to grapple with. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Carl. I've enjoyed talking to you.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.